Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start out by thanking all of you for joining us today. I'm going to tell you we're going to have a great session and we're going to learn a lot from someone that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I'm Steve Zobrick, COO at Forthright. And for those of you who have joined us but haven't worked with us before, I want to give you a very quick 4 to 5 minute intro. Forthright's been helping their clients optimize their application delivery for decades. And for us, it's more than just about the tools and having the right technology. It's about how do we supercharge your end user experiences? So we actually built our entire practice around being user-centric in everything we do. Now, what that means is that our passion and our focus, it's not centered around what tools or products or even the processes that are optimal for us, but rather we put ourselves in your shoes. We pay very close attention to the experience and outcomes that your technology choices actually have on your end user population. And so, over the years, we've recognized that many of our clients, or really all of them, fall into one of three categories. Some need consulting services around strategic initiatives. Maybe they're doing prototyping of new technologies. Others need additional resources, right, for day-to-day operations or new projects. And the third group, well, they're very focused on reducing their operational cost and adding efficiency. So they want to focus on their core business, and they'll look to Forthright to basically take over full responsibility of very specific technology sets. And this really comes into play on today's conversation. Now, regardless of where you might fall, we've got 6 core service offerings that basically address these different needs. And some of our clients, well, they'll leverage 1 or 2, and some of them actually use all of them. So if you're interested in finding out more about any of these services, you want to talk about this, please reach out, give us a ring at our office, or send us a quick note at success@forthright.com. And we would be very happy to follow up with you and open up a conversation. So let's move on to today's spotlight conversation. So today we're going to focus around how do you deliver 100% uptime. Now we all know that most environments have a significant amount of complexity, right? There's many moving parts, and each of those moving parts, well, they can cause downtime in your environment. So we've asked Frank Marino, our VP Professional Services, to join us today, and he's going to discuss how he delivers 100% uptime for Forthright clients. What are his secrets? And the goal and the hope for us is that you all can benefit from some of his trade secrets that he's learned over the decades, basically, as he kind of talks about what he does for dozens of our client environments. And then, of course, you could take that back and replicate that success in your own environment. So by optimizing your service delivery, you too can provide your users with an exceptional experience, which, of course, in part means the workspace environment has to remain always available. So I'm really happy and excited to introduce Frank Marino to our Spotlight series, although he has joined us many times before. And Frank, maybe you can kick off the conversation by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background at Forthright.
Thank you, Steve. So I've been at Forthright now, I think it's 16, maybe 17 years at this point in time. And my background with Forthright has always been at the architect level. And in the last 10 years or so, we've provided a new practice at Forthright around end user experience. Prior to that, we were doing a lot of end user computing stuff that has really kind of like pushed us into the foreground for the technologies that we work with, Citrix being one of them. And so what we've come to learn is how integral the user experience is with those technologies. So I manage the teams that are responsible for implementing, advising, consulting, managing all of these solutions that we implement. And I run the UX practice at Forthright, where we deep dive into the personas of each of your users and really kind of like connect the two together between the use of technology and that the users themselves and how they accomplish what they're trying to do. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, customers only care about getting work done. So no one cares what tools are necessarily there to get there. But obviously, it requires a lot of effort on our time. And I think that that's what you're looking for from me today, is kind of tell us how we do it behind the scenes here. I'm looking forward to that.
Great. Well, get ready, because I've got several questions for you, and this should be entertaining. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a very quick poll. Kristen, maybe you can bring up the first set of poll questions.
The first one is, do you trust your monitoring system? Everyone could answer.
Maybe.
Well, it's better than no.
Mm-hmm.
This is true. I expected some no's, but that's good.
Okay. All right. Next one is, do you feel you have adequate monitoring deployed in your environment? Okay, there you go. So everybody said yes to that one. And the third one for right now is, are the dependencies for each business group, for example, sales, HR, accounting, mapped out? And this one is 100%, I don't know.
Very interesting results. Very interesting results. So we're gonna. I have a question around monitoring, but I'm not going to start there. Frank, I know that one of your key messages that you like to say all the time is know your business. Can you
Yeah.
explain how that impacts IT operations and uptime? I mean, we're all focused on technology. How does this impact operations and uptime?
So whenever we take on any kind of operations, monitoring or management type of operations, the first thing we have to understand is the business itself. And the reason for this is that we commonly in IT resort ourselves to the software we use as the business. In Citrix environments, Office 365, these are tools, softwares within our stack that somehow have created our roles and responsibility. The truth of the matter is that those are tools for an objective, and those objectives need to be understood by IT in order to actually provide what is really 100% uptime. So the first thing to understand in knowing your business is that that's where our poll question number 3 came from, which I thought was interesting that people indicated that they don't know. This is exactly where you start by, let's define how we achieve 100% uptime. What is it the 100% uptime we care about? Is it that our ESX host has never gone down? Who cares if it goes down? If the services that it is necessary on that particular host is available to the users, no one cares, right? And this is important to reframe as IT, reframe how we deliver services. But you can only do that if you're speaking the same language as your business. And so understanding how businesses attribute activities, right? And then you'll find that you have the civilian IT people. These are your users that have some sort of IT background, and they'll try to step into the side of IT and be able to say, oh, that's the Exchange server, that's VMware or Citrix or this, that, and the other. The truth of the matter is that they're working off of the information that's being presented to them. And if we shift the conversation to outcome-based within the business, it changes the frame altogether. It takes them out of that civilian IT member and puts them into a business person trying to get work done. An example of this is when we talk about accounting or accounts payable, payroll, I'm sure is something that's near and dear to all of us. Telling someone that APP01 or something like that is down means absolutely nothing to the majority of people. Like, no one cares. However, if that is payroll, we can't process payroll, knowing that APP01 is necessary for payroll, and then that uses this auxiliary service, and that's using this other service, and then you combine those together. That's how you define payroll. Then we're using the same language, right? Because they being the end user, the person in accounting trying to process payroll, they have no clue what APP01 is. Now, they may have that exposed to them. They're trying to help you using your language, change the frame, know their business, know what they're trying to accomplish, and that's how you can start attributing to services as opposed to servers and systems, and those kind of things start failing, because they will. I mean, that's nature. My best example, by the way, I'm sorry, Steve,
That's okay.
is Netflix is a perfect example of systems go down every single day, not only on purpose, but also by accident. Yet all of us have a Netflix account, all of us stream Netflix all day long, and I'm sure none of us have any idea of which systems are broken down, whatever. We go to Netflix, we watch our favorite shows, and that's it. That's understanding the business, and the IT team is doing exactly what they need to do. How do I make sure that user still streams? So there you go.
So I can't speak for obviously the participants on the webinar today, but obviously 100% of them have monitoring, right? They feel like have sufficient monitoring, and if we know how most monitoring is set up, is unfortunately it is actually tracking whether ESX07 is actually up and running, whether the individual servers are up and running. And so now that we kind of have a better understanding of the importance of monitoring business services as a whole, how do we gain that kind of visibility? I mean, what do you suggest IT shops do to close that gap?
So I think there's great tools available to manage and monitor these softwares that I mentioned: Citrix, Exchange, VMware, Nutanix. They all have these are systems that you can get metrics from. Knowing the tools as to how you can tie those back to your business is really a focal point to the 100% uptime. Now, where the individual tools come into play is that not all tools are created equal, okay? And not all of them have the capability to tie back to a business service, which is unfortunate, but sometimes that's necessary. Examples are APM tools are traditionally around an application, not necessarily a business service. You then tie that application to a business service as an example, right? A lot of ITSM solutions, ServiceNow as an example, have now business service management built into their product because they recognize that there are configuration items necessary to deliver that said service, and so forth and so on, right? Tying it back to Citrix, in Citrix, you have tools specifically to manage Citrix infrastructure, right? This is the hardware it's sitting on, the cloud infrastructure it's sitting on, the application performance it's sitting on, and the user experience that you're trying to monitor, right? These are all the different layers of your tools. Where we want to focus on is how each one of those tie back to that service or services that you're trying to monitor for. And then ultimately, are you constantly updating those thresholds to meet that said 100% uptime, to meet those business needs? An example would be we go through changes on a regular basis, right? On an ongoing basis, there are updates every single month that go into your environment. At least Windows updates. Let's just leave it at that to keep it simple. Having tools to watch what's happening over time is extremely important, because while this new update did not impact users and their ability to actually get work done, it may have impacted the performance of the overall environment, even if it's only a few percentage points, right? Well, what happens is we're malleable as people. So we start now saying, oh, no big deal. We went from 60% utilization to 65% utilization. We're still within the threshold, no big deal. Next month, guess what happens? Another change like that. Now it's 68%. And before you know it, you're gradually degrading the situation, and your tools are there to help you recognize, is this still acceptable? Is this meeting the business need? If it's not, then we have a problem. One tool in particular that I want to call out in the world of user experience is actually ControlUp. This is a tool that we use internally for actually business outcomes. Actually, they have a product called Scalpies that we're particular fans of, and we actually use this as part of our SLA monitoring for every one of our managed contracts that leverage Citrix. So this is important because what this is doing is that every 5 minutes, this thing is logging in as a user and is telling us whether this system is up, down, how it's performing, so forth and so on. And we see this over time. So this is our control element. And this is important to us because now we use that control against what users are seeing, right? And because this is happening all day long, we're able to now make that connection and say, hey, you know what, there's a variance here, okay? In comparison, now is it the user? Is it a profile? Is it the system they're connecting to? Right? Because the control says otherwise. Now we can shift the control to those systems, to those profiles, and so forth and so on, and then see if it creates the same situation or it's other factors. This is the kind of stuff that you get when you know your tools and you know how they're tying back to outcomes, right? Really, really important when you're talking about those things.
Very interesting. So, I guess the next question would come is, so we've figured out how to get effective situational awareness, right? Not just on the systems, but on the different business services that are being delivered. The next thing that kind of comes up is what and when to automate. And I want to get your thoughts on that. And I've spoken to a lot of people over the decades of doing this, and of course, everybody has an opinion. Someone who does this, I would say, very successfully. What are your thoughts on automation?
Yeah, well, if you're on my team, you probably hear about automation and automating on a regular basis, probably ad nauseum. Now, I think where people take a fail in automation is not that they're not able to accomplish a goal, is that they'll take a stance of saying it's not worth automating or spending the time to script it or whatever the case may be, because I'm going to be able to do this in a couple of clicks. And that may be true, and they're probably right. Actually, they're probably more right than not in that example. However, what they're not accounting for is the point of impact to the point of resolution, okay? And this is a real thing when we're talking about 100% uptime. So let's be clear when we say a business service is what we're defining as 100% uptime, the ability to get this particular item of your job done. Okay, that's important. We're not saying that server 01 is never going down. That is not the case here, right? So what happens now is that when server 01 is a part of that equation to deliver said service, payroll is the example again, we run into a situation where how do we know from the point of impact to the point of resolution? Now, that may happen in the middle of the night, where something happens because updates or whatever the case may be. And then come Monday morning, you fix it because it's a click, 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 and you're done, right? It may take you weeks to come up with that sequence of events to create that automation to correct it. But if it's happening at 2 o'clock in the morning and the point of impact to the point of resolution is minutes, seconds versus days, hours, right? Sorry, hours and days. That's what we're trying to, that's when you recognize when you want to automate, okay? Now, this is something you'll get yourself into a trap or a loop where you'll invest a significant amount of time. So I want to caution everyone with the following. Please take my advice. Solve the problem first, as in address mitigate the incident first when it happens before you start going down. Okay, so part of the when factor is when you're addressing point of impact to remediation, just address the fixing part first, and then let's start to automate. Okay, so that's when. What to automate is interesting because when you start getting into complex situations where approvals are needed, you create if-then scenarios, those kind of things. So this is an area where it's a gradual education process that you go through. Now, in certain cases, you can make the argument you can buy into this automation. I'm going to level with you guys and tell you that yes, if you use a provider, selfish plug here for Forthright, there's automation that's there that is inherent because you are using the service, great. But that's not all the automation. Over time, it continues to evolve because we have to know the business. And so now what to automate goes back to the original business components. So we recognize when you can and what you can automate. If things start introducing tiers of approval processes and things like that that need to get in place, and there are reasons for those things, recognize that automatic and automate are two different things, right? We can make things automatic, and then we can make things where they are automated once sequence of events happen. And so those are where you start, having workflows to address those things. So the what to automate is start simple with things you all know. I'm not telling you guys anything new, service restarts, things like that. But when you start thinking about VM resizing, taking advantage of auto scaling in the case of Citrix. If you're using cloud environments, using up-down schedules, right? Hopefully dynamic uptimes, blueprints. These are the things to what to automate because they are inherently good for you. Data governance, that's a great thing to automate because I can tell you right now, too many times you see environments where they have no data governance policies set up, and so they'll run out of disk space, right? They're hosting 15 years when they only need 4, right? Or they're HIPAA 6, these kind of things where, people want to hold on to everything forever. Having these predetermined defined automations happening, they're happening for you so that you're preventing an issue from occurring. And then ultimately you're going to have workflows and things like that that you'll advance to, but that takes a little bit to get there. That's not an overnight thing. So, yeah.
Very, very interesting.
And another selfish plug, by the way, for the Control Up guys. If you happen to be using that product, they have a ton of built-in automation scripts and things like that with inside of their product that are out of the gate. If you want to know something that Forthright does in the use of that tool, we have a rule set up that whenever there's an error or warning on the screen, we actually have it send a ticket to to Forthright, so we can address that in a preactive, like a preemptive type of situation. Obviously, the error happens, that's a given, but if we didn't know about it or went unnoticed for a lengthy period of time, usually that means it builds up over time and becomes worse. Having a tool like that allows for that to happen, where you can detect an error on screen to the user. The user is not going to be contacting you, because unless it's a huge work stoppage, the first thing they're going to do is close the app, reopen it, and the first thing you're going to ask them is, well, did you take a screenshot? Oh, I forgot to. All right, when it happens again, go ahead and give me a screenshot. And of course, they're going to forget, and this is going to be a perpetual cycle before it becomes a real, work stoppage event. So just something else to throw out there.
That's great. I like the fact that you addressed the reactive and proactive nature of how you can leverage automation. That's quite interesting. Kristen, let's roll into the next poll.
Does your change management process include a defined criteria for success? The answer is overwhelmingly no. Does your environment include a full dev and staging environments for testing? Mostly yes, and a couple no's.
So that's interesting. Frank, I know that this next segment is a pet peeve of yours. So talk to me about, how do you define effective change management, and how can it make or break your success? And what I want to hear, and I think it'll be fun for our audience, is maybe a story or two, because we've got lots of them. We just won't mention client names, of how this comes into an issue. People like to shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah. So let's start with change management. So I think that this is a term that is well defined, and there are defined frameworks that understand this, ITIL being one of them. Now, you could sit there and become a 13 process expert of ITIL, or let me just give it to you in the lowdown, and that is, if your change management is nothing more than a set schedule, a person who's going to approve that change, okay, and then a doer, this is a very failed change management, okay? The poll question, which was really good, was criteria for success, okay? Define the outcome that is supposed to be achieved within this change is so important, okay? If you cannot do that, this is not a very good change, okay? It's not about approvals to that you're going to be tampering with some system. That again, we're caring about what the business outcome is trying to deliver on, and it has nothing to do with the fact that server 01 is going down, or you're flicking a flag from 0 to 1. Okay, those things are irrelevant to anyone. So where effective change management comes into play is that when you have a defined process for what you're going to change, what configuration items are involved. That's what we're determining the what. Configuration item being defined as anything in the system, whether that's application system, the server system, those kind of things. All right. The business service impact it's going to have, right? This is now when you start understanding your business. All right. And then who's performing it? What is the testing procedure that's going to be done, right? This is where the dev and staging now comes into play, all right? Understanding things, whether this is a multi-day event, how that criteria for success is going to be measured throughout the change itself. And then ultimately you have approvers and doers and things like that. Now, what the approver is looking at this point in time is that you've told them, him or her, or a cab of some sort, sorry, I'll stay away from acronyms, change advisory board, where hey, I want to accomplish this outcome. We need to improve the performance of the accounting server. I'm just going to go back with that since that's the overarching theme here. Payroll to improve processing time, whatever the case. That is the objective of what we're doing here, right? Or in the case of patching, things like that, security, meeting our security requirements, those kind of things. That's what you're telling the approvers for. And you're telling them that in order to do that, we are going to test in this manner, right? This is how the service is being done right now. We're going to apply a change on such and such date and time, and this is what the outcome is going to be, and this is how we're going to test for it. So now they can make an informed decision that says, oh, you need to be touching server 01, APP 01, and it's going to be impacting my payroll system. What time and date is that? Oh, that's on a Saturday, you know, the second Saturday of the month. Okay, no payroll is going to happen. But on the off chance that that falls on, say, the 15th, and you got payroll happening, maybe they want to tell them no, not to do it there, you know, create an inherent delay because of those things. This is what effective change management does. Now, the best part about that is that the informed change approver, okay, now has the ability to say, hey guys, you know, because things go wrong, what happens when it goes wrong? Like, you're going to be testing for it. You told me that it's going to have some sort of improvement on the accounting server. Say we'll see a processing improvement of 10%. Let's just use that as an example, right? What if it doesn't do that, right? What do we do to roll back, right? All of a sudden now that's now defined. There's no question. We're not at the point of no return and thinking to ourselves, what are we gonna do? Like, that was already approved. So if we're unhappy with the rollback plan, right, then that could be part of the approval process. Because what happens all too often is that we put in a change, okay? We set a time and date, we set a test procedure, which is we were able to ping it, it's up. That's an effective change procedure, okay? Go back to knowing your business, you'll understand how to test for those services effectively, okay? And then you're there, all that worked out, but it didn't give us the desired outcome. So now there's a decision to be made for the approvers to say, hey, it's not giving us the decision, I want to roll back, right? Or we're going to live with it, right? We assume the risk at that point in time, whether it delivered or didn't deliver, right? And this is a firm example that happens. Customers far too often create these inherent change process approvals, okay, where you have a scheduling team, you have a cab team, and then you have these intermediate weird like status conversations to make sure that everybody is ready before you hit the button to say go. And that's not like, though they have their purposes, but they're just cogs. There's no oversight in the real effective change management. And then what you find is that because they start breaking down these different services, they find themselves in situations where this change needs to get done by the end of the month, but the scheduling team doesn't meet till the first of the month, and all of a sudden now that can't happen. And then you throw in an emergency change request, and now you bypass all of the actual processes to determine that this is going to be a successful change because of some weird scheduling conflict that doesn't really matter. And then all of a sudden now you're rolling out changes and you didn't have rollback plans, you didn't have proper testing plans. So you're making these changes. And look, in technology, you have situations where changes need to be done without the proper testing procedures. That happens, guys. 0-day events, production outages, a lot of that stuff goes right out the window. But understand that by holding to an effective change process, they have you account for those things. What happens when a production system is down and you need to make changes? Do you have ECRs in place? Sorry, emergency change requests procedures in place? If you do, then you're basically saying, hey, this approver is taking accountability for the fact that this situation happened, unfortunately, without their doing. This is what they decided to do. IT is performing on it. Here's the information that we need within an emergency change to be able to get this done, so forth and so on. The 15 minutes it takes to deliver that versus the 6-7+ hours you're going to be sitting there trying to roll back, I promise you, that's where effective change management comes into play. And all too often you're going to see that where, oh, we got to get this fixed right now. No one takes a second to pause and just say, hey, this is being defined. But defining it at the moment of the problem, when the system is down, no one can pay attention when there's fire all around you. So work out your change management plan ahead of time. Understand what happens when you eliminate the need of multiple approvers. You don't have proper testing because it's an emergency. What happens there? And if you have those defined, you're going to see that happens. And then you're going to find yourself in a situation where a lot of approvals are happening and so forth and so on. You're going to introduce something called a standard change or a routine change situation where you'll have routine changes that are happening on an ongoing basis that are still A, accounted for, B, have proper testing procedures. You're just eliminating some of the intermediate type of steps that cause inherent delays. Some people don't like the term auto-approve, but that's essentially where they are. But they're still tracked, they're still recorded. So when something happens, because that inherently will, you already had the defined rollback. It just means that whoever the approver was approved it 12 years ago or whatever, when that's how we approved that these changes were happening. That's effective change management at work.
That's interesting, because if while change management is addressing the known modifications to the environment, how critical is things like problem management to deal with incidents that happen on an ongoing basis? And I'm not sure if you started to touch on that or if you handle that differently. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So known modifications is where change management comes into play. Problems happen in environments because all this was written by people. You have users that use the system in similar ways but different, and then inherently things happen. Errors happen. The use cases were misunderstood. All that happens, right? A system goes down, and respectively, hardware problems, cloud outages, you name it, right? These things happen. So problem management as a whole is mostly looked at in ITIL as causation, understanding causation. Now, this does not mean that you have to have a major incident for you to be looking at problem management. And I think this is where most customers, or I don't mean customers in general, but this is where most organizations look at problem management, where we're only addressing the big things, right? Oh, the system was down, SAN went out. Well, make sure the SAN is redundant. All right, cool. That's how they look at these things. And honestly, it's those are the easy. And I do mean this. Those are the easy. Those are long nights, but those are the easy scenarios where you say, oh, the SAN controller went down, caused this whole series of events to happen. We fixed it. We're good. Causation was determined. We created a remediation process, and problem management happened. And while that is in fact true, okay, problem management is where you take any kind of incident, all right, and when you start developing and understanding patterns, okay. So I mentioned earlier that one of the tools we use in ControlUp is able to help us in understanding events that are happening when the users don't notify us, because many of us in IT do not hear from our users as often as we should. That is not necessarily a problem that's not a problem that IT necessarily is trying to solve, and it's also not 100% on IT's fault. Users want to get their job done, and it's not necessarily talking to IT about problems, right? You're not a therapist or something. So, but ultimately, that's what's happening. So by having the necessary tools that are tracking these type of events from happening, okay, and to some degree you could make the argument, Frank, you're creating some little alert fatigue because you're just bombarding me with all these problems, and I would tell you yes, but if you have the right tools for proper consolidation, this is when the new sexy term is called AI ops, but basically it's incident consolidation based on like events and things like that. So if your tools don't do that, highly recommend you reevaluate those tools. I could definitely make recommendations on some of them. OpsRamp happened to be one of them, but there are several. Splunk does something like that. There's great tools out there for this kind of stuff, guys. But anyways, they correlate these events, and so while these are insignificant at a moment in time, you can start building up on them and seeing them at scale and say, hey, wait a second, we have a problem here. Every morning for the last 2 weeks, there has been an Outlook error when people are launching Outlook, right? How do we address that? Now, this may impact nothing of significance in that moment in time, but if we understand what that is, say a shared mailbox or a shared group for some end of month processing, guess what? It probably didn't matter on the 15th of December, but come the 31st, that may be a problem, right? And so this is where problem management now comes into play, and this is how you can achieve that you have issues that are occurring over time, but you are proactively now addressing causation, okay? And this is how you achieve that 100% uptime. In a Citrix environment, an area where this comes into play is where typically in most Citrix environments that have a regular change process of once a month, opening up images and updating, whatever the case may be. This is where you can take in between when you do your master change for the month and introduce other changes that you can be testing for to address those problems, where now you can start doing things like pilot groups, canary testing, all these fancy terms that are basically saying, hey, I'm trying to test for this problem. Is it happening? Because you have those tools that are monitoring it, you can now determine if those changes are happening. The event correlation that you already had in your tools determine if it's dropping down. That's problem management at work to get you to 100% uptime. Yes, that's awesome.
You spoke about a lot of different areas that require. No, it's great. It's great. I love the content. You spoke about a lot of different areas where focus is important. Being proactive, whether it's thinking through these procedures, whether it's understanding the causation of things, being proactive with automation, all these things. I know that we spend a lot of effort working toward, and it's part of that success of being up 100% of the time. The issue is that what we see a lot in most of our clients is a lot of firefighting. Unfortunately, they're thrown into battle, right? Because things just break and they're not necessarily set up for success because they've got to focus on putting the fire out. Like we talked about earlier, restoration of service is first, right? You've got to bring the service back online. Which makes it really difficult, if not impossible, for them to be proactive. How important is it to find ways to get your team to focus?
Yeah.
And how do you do that, by the way? Because I think that's hard for most IT professionals.
So I would tell you guys the following. Let's take a look at your own house for a moment. Those that own any property or rent or whatever, there are things you have to do to upkeep your place. Okay, you have cleaning to do. If you have a pool, you have pool service to do. If you have an HOA, they definitely tell you other things you need to be doing. There's lawn, so forth and so on, right? You are one person, and if you're fortunate enough to have a spouse, you now have two. If you have kids, you have child labor, which is fantastic. But at any given time, the capacity as to what you can get done simultaneously is met, okay? And so the question then becomes, what do you prioritize? In IT, we prioritize a problem, right? A problem is defined in this case as something is down, right? That's actually an incident, but whatever. ITIL be damned. So an incident happens, and that's what you're dealing with. Commonly we refer to it as fires. And so we're out there, putting out all these different fires because that's what we have deemed to be priority. Okay. So Steve, you asked, how do you focus? Okay. First is to understand your capacity. Okay. And if you're trying to do this in-house, that's totally fine. God bless you. And there are limitations to what you can do, right? But understanding that is important. In my household, it's myself and my wife, and therefore there's only two things we can do at any given point in time unless we outsource it to some sort of service provider, like a lawn guy, a pool guy, so forth and so on, okay? And so understanding that is the first thing. Going back to knowing your business allows you to determine how you actually achieve said focus. Because if you don't do that, what you have determined, you being the IT person or the IT team, is putting out fires. The funny thing is that if I were to ask everyone right now as a impromptu poll question, okay, what is more important, that the application server is down that's used for, I don't know, development, or payroll? I'm going to assume that payroll is going to win. I'm just saying, just throwing it out there. Now, same scenario, and we say, hey, some exterior service that's being used to help customers and payroll, which one takes priority? I think that's going to be a personal choice for most people, and they're going to take that. They're going to take that payroll. See, that's a decision point that had to be understood, and this is where knowing your business all of a sudden now comes into play, because guess what? When you know your business, that question has already been answered. You have defined what is a tier 1 service application capability, and therefore hey, listen, when that situation happens, not if, when that situation happens, guess what? We know how to address it. Okay, and yes, I'm talking about a problem, guys, or an incident that something is down, or whatever the case may be. I'm referring to functions at this point in time, and not necessarily that the service is inoperable, right? It may be slow, it may be, impacted, those kind of things. Technically, you can make the argument that a threshold has been hit for uptime or whatever the case may be, but ultimately, the understanding the business at that point in time determines how you address this problem. So that's how you go about it. Another thing you could do is, much like in my household, right? I work a lot of hours by choice, of course, and therefore I need to be able to keep my house in order, and therefore I do have a lawn guy, I do have a pool guy, right? I have now expanded my capability, right? And so this allows me to be proactive. This allows me to expand where my focus areas are. It's on keeping my house, up to, clean. It's on, cooking for my family. It's on those kind of things because that's what I want to do. Same goes for your environment, right? You're going to determine what's important for you in your household, right, to do. One of my responsibilities is to make sure that the lawn guy does come at a regular basis, that my pool guy comes at a regular basis. If I'm unsatisfied with their performance, guess what I got to do? I need to notify them. That is a proactive measure of what I can do. It may seem silly, but the truth is that that handing that off allows me to now deal with that said fire in a different way. It's not me. It's not myself having to do that. That's the same exact situation that happens within organizations to create that ability to focus. This is extremely hard, and that's one of the reasons why I think we left it to be last, is that all of the things we've just talked about to lead us up to here, this is a huge focal point, an area of major concerns, because we're usually on a situation where how do we get there? Well, guys, I think we've laid out a bunch of things for what you can do at this point in time. It may take some extra hours, increase your capacity momentarily. That's another great opportunity, is how do you offload this to something else so that you can achieve those other areas, right? Deal with noise, and then you can work on strategic things. That's an area where you can take this, because ultimately your role in IT is to service the business. And again, I can't stress this enough, going back to knowing your business is going to be so helpful. It's how you're going to get budget. It's how you're going to get the new toys. It's how you're going to get staff. If you can't associate those things to the business, you're going to have a very hard time. What you're going to sound like is a child that is whining and screaming and whatever, and is not going to help the uptime conversation. But if you're talking about App 01, the CFO has no idea what App 01 is, unless that happens to also be their workstation, but that's a different story.
even then, right?
Yeah,
Those are some really interesting points. Kristen, let's roll into poll number 3.
The question is, do you perform complete HA testing no less than every 12 months? So if you can type in the chat, yes or no. And the next poll is, do you use a detailed HA testing script that defines detailed expected outcomes from each test? The first one, once again, is, do you perform complete HA testing no less than every 12 months? That's the one to type in the chat, and the other one's up on the screen. And the answer to the first question, most of the answers were yes. And then the second question, I will share that one. Mostly, I don't know.
All right, so that's interesting. So let's talk about that a little bit as far as HA testing, and I think that becomes important because many clients, assuming they followed everything that you discussed, can they achieve 100% uptime if they just deploy 2 or more data centers? Is it really that simple?
So if all you needed to do to deliver services to your users could be within those data centers, then that, I guess you could say yes. But the truth is that each service is treated differently on purpose because you have tiers, you have requirements, and so forth and so on. And then ultimately, things that sometimes are not considered as important, I'm going to go back to one of the major focuses of this conversation, is Citrix. Citrix is not considered, in many companies for some reason, a tier 1 application, yet it is the application delivery mechanism for all the tier 1 applications. Why it's not there, I don't know. That just seems silly to me. So that's probably just because they don't know their business, they don't recognize their dependencies, they don't know how to get those tools to showcase how that is important to be able to deliver that payroll application. Yet again, I got to go back to that. And so that is an example. Now, optimal readiness state, that payroll system is going to be important to recognize, during payroll and those kind of things. There are other tier 1 solutions, like whatever it is that you deliver to your end customer, whether that's a hosted application, whether that's a service you provide. If you're a law firm or insurance company, you're doing claims, that kind of stuff. These things need to be available to you so that you can service your customer, right? And in many cases, that's being delivered in these fashions. Now, it may be acceptable for some of those services, say, I don't know, email to be delayed, but not necessarily your ability to service a claim with a person on the phone, right? We have many cases where businesses are transactional and they need to get it while the iron's hot, and therefore you're being on the phone, being able to process on that call is the most important thing, because that calling back, you'll never get them back. They'll never call you back. You've now lost a sale, and that's important to recognize there. So there's a couple things that I want to point out for Citrix specifically, because I think if I don't teach you guys these or tell you guys these things, I think that's unfair. So let me go ahead and do that. First and foremost, if you are using Citrix Cloud, please ignore what it says for recommendations for the cloud connector sizing, and always have more cloud connectors. Okay, if you have a small environment, say under 1,000 seats, 2 is probably going to be enough. 3 is better, and quite frankly, they're just not that large of a VM for the kind of capability that you get. So please do yourself a favor. If you're using Citrix Cloud, have Citrix Cloud connectors, multiple of them. 1 is never enough. And they size them for like 20,000. That's so not even true. Don't even kid yourself. I mean, maybe if it was a monster VM, like 20 cores and something like that, but that's not. Yeah, and that's not an indictment on Citrix. I just think that there may be some other factors you're not recognizing. So
just a lot of liability too.
Yeah.
So connectors, you want to spread that out.
Correct. It is your connection to the to Citrix Cloud. So please do that. There's a feature that was implemented not too long ago called Rendezvous, and I think it's important that all of you guys leverage this feature. This is similar to local host cache in some aspect, in the sense that should the connector go down, still having access to those set applications, because you're creating a dependency. So this is go back to what you were saying, Steve. Having 2 data centers isn't enough in this example, because there's a service involved in here that therefore, it's not all in-house, so it doesn't really apply. Same thing goes for like if you're using hosted Exchange or those kind of things. So just keep that in mind. So a Rendezvous is an example of where this can happen. Cloud connectors can still fail. They can have communication problems, a firewall change, whatever the case may be. Excuse me. What Rendezvous will do is circumvent the cloud connector as a dependency and still be able to have that connection to Citrix Cloud to be able to service your users and apps. Highly recommended feature. It was not there day one with Citrix Cloud. It quickly became a feature for Citrix Cloud, and I don't think many people are taking advantage of that, and I think you all should. Another one that is not as relevant, or sorry, not as well defined, is that when we talk about resource workloads, commonly we tell people, hey, we're trying to do one resource workload for each site, data center, that kind of stuff. My recommendation is to have multiple per, and the reason for that is that there are inherent reasons for configurations and settings inside of Citrix Cloud that you will benefit from having if you create multiple resource workloads, even if they go to the same locations. They can still leverage the same cloud connector, so that's not a big deal. There's really more of a configuration of scenario. And then ultimately, just because Citrix is up does not mean your applications are ready. So please understand, back to knowing your business and having your tools understand what those dependencies are. And when you do those complete HA testing, please take everything to failure. You need to know where that breaking point is. That's how you can test for it effectively. You obviously need a change window for that, so forth and so on. Those are my recommendations.
And so I guess that's why the having a detailed script becomes really important. So that way, from a business perspective, if you've passed your HA testing, you know it actually has passed, and you know what was tested versus, well, I rebooted the server and it failed over. So that particular test works. Sometimes I know in the field we've had outages where rebooting the server solves the problem, but if the server stays up and a service fails, for example, all of a sudden you've got a failed service.
That's
So you
correct.
really need to look at all the different ways of testing. I completely concur with that. I've seen that a lot as well.
Yeah, and if you have a tool that is constantly logging in on a regular basis, representing a user, you can actually test that throughout the entire process, so you can see what the impact of the user is. So that's another great recommendation.
Oh, we forgot to talk about that in the tools. The login simulators are a big part of what we do as well. I think we missed that, but that's a good thing for the audience as well. I thought we would pause here for a minute and take some questions and see if there's any questions that someone might want to send in the chat. In the meantime, there are two. One is, how large should a typical EUC team be? I'm going to start with that one. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, this is going to be tough because there's a certain economies of scale that happen. The first thing is going to be whether or not you have a 24-hour service that you need to have, and whether or not inside of your EUC team you're also handling your infrastructure. So that's going to be something to be considered there. I think a lot of people may undersize their EUC teams quite a bit because they fail to realize how many components it has, and they think that it's being serviced by another team member. So as an example, a common admin or engineer within inside an EUC team is working on applications, infrastructure, storage, networking, ADC, and ultimately authentication, user profiles, and user interaction, right? That is a lot of things to worry about. And so you could be an enterprise and say, oh, okay, we have a storage team, we have a network team, we have an infrastructure team, we have a EUC team, which are usually focused around profiles. We have an app team, app dev team, we have app owners, and you can see where that becomes really, really large. But if I take a stab of the people on the call, their size, their environment, you need to have the bare minimum is probably somewhere in the 4 to 5 range of people is probably a given. If you're in the smaller scale, like say sub 100 seats and you're 9 to 5, you could probably half that because of the 9 to 5. But as you start increasing your application numbers, so like let's say for every 100 users, add yourself another application to the mix, and then you have your 10 productivity apps, so that's 11 right there. So keep doing that. It changes a little bit as you start getting to the thousands of users, every thousands of users, add another 10 apps, that kind of thing. But you need to account for management of that on an ongoing basis. If it's 24 hours, you have to have a minimum of 4. 5 is better because then you actually have real coverage. So yeah, that's a tough question, but it's not one. It's not, oh, we need a Citrix guy or gal. That's not.
What's interesting is this is well documented as well on the Citrix knowledge base on how you should build your teams and the certain skill sets that you should have internally. It's in the
VDI playbook for VDI workbook, I think is what it's called now. But yes, it's part of the service delivery team. It's defined there.
Yeah, you should go look for it because if you're looking to add staff or augment it, it's something that you can obviously bring to your management team and say, look, this is what the manufacturer is recommending, and we are short-staffed. That's why we're running into challenges. I know we're short on time. I have another question here. How do you effectively manage image updates and ensure you don't cause outages? Because obviously every time we change an image, a golden image, you at that point are taking a risk, and obviously you have to make changes on a regular basis.
Yeah. So the first thing is that I'm gonna try to be brief and at the same time give you a lot of data. So watch the recording. The first thing is that track your changes is going to be huge. And yes, you can do that in a system, a change management system, or those kind of things. What we have found in our practice is that the simplest solution is sometimes the best way to do it. There's literally a text file in the root of C that is baked into the image, and those are the changes that happen. Seems rudimentary, but I can promise you that it forces you to think about every change you made. And we just have our own naming convention and things like that to determine whether it was an add, remove, change, whether it's an update, a non-update. Those kind of things are identified there. that forces you to think that way. The reason you put it there, not necessarily outside of that, is because you are usually inside of the image when you're trying to understand a problem, not outside the image looking in. So that's an area to put it there. When it comes to actually making updates to the changes, Citrix has a great versioning system that can be used. Depending on how many simultaneous changes you do in multi-stream, this is something you'll have to think about in how you deliver. May require you to not take advantage of versioning the way it was intended, and you may have to. Versioning is really designed for sequential, right? So like this is your base, you make a change, it worked or it didn't work, go to the next image, so forth and so on. If you're taking the same image, and this is when you now have some image management concepts where if you have all users using the same image, you create scenarios where an app change for persona 1 versus an app change for persona 2 becomes a problem, because now you need 2 simultaneous streams to make that change. So that's an image management situation where you address those, but understanding those, take advantage of versioning when you can, makes life simple. That dev and staging that we talked about, part of your change management process, where you actually do the new sexy term again is the canary testing. So take some random users, usually 100 or 10%, depending on which is greater, and throw it at your users unbeknownst to them. That sounds great in practice, but there's also a reality to that. So if there's massive UI changes, that don't do that. But changes like Windows updates and stuff like that, you can definitely do. They won't know the difference. And I don't think you should know who the users are. You should just basically establish a tenere group, constantly change them, because that way you don't impact the users. So the same user over and over again. I know as IT, we like to have our favorite users and things like that. I don't recommend that for this, because they'll make exceptions for you. They're like, oh, I know that I had this problem, but it was no big deal. I just hit OK and moved on. Like, don't do that. Don't. You want to know, fresh set of eyes, never experienced before, that kind of stuff. Yeah, and then don't undersell the time it takes to actually hold out a change process where you are in dev and staging. A day worth of things is not enough. And then ultimately, when you have those right tools, you can have established baselines that you knew what it was beforehand. So again, just because the change happened, those updates went in, just because the application is working, that does not mean that weren't impacts to the environment. If you don't know what they are, if you don't know that the login testing went from a 30-second login to a 35-second login, probably not noticeable to a user, but remember, this is your control, and your control was impacted. So what does that mean to your users? Understand that impact, and as that continues to build over time, you become numb to this. All of a sudden, it's now 45 seconds. And now you're 60 seconds.
That's a great tip, because we've had bad Mondays where clients didn't leverage baselining, and you have an application update that tripled the amount of RAM that it was using, and all of a sudden all the density calculations were off.
Yes.
That could be a big deal. Great tip. So we're a little past 2 o'clock, and we're in the last section, and we'll try to speed through this. I'm sure that there are some on the call that are thinking there's a lot of things we discussed today. They're kind of high level, they're big picture ideas of how we operate our IT shops and our operations, and they're not necessarily easy to do overnight. And some may feel like we don't really do that well. I think some of the responses to the poll questions identified some of the gaps that might be out there. How can your group help clients? I mean, I think we wrap that up. But what are some of the options where people want to follow up and say, hey, I like what you were talking about. I'd like to do some of that here. Frank, can you help me?
Yeah. So I think that at Forthright, we have 3 levels of service that are important to understand. One is a more of an assisted self type of service type of situation, where the use of these tools that requires manpower, it requires education, it requires upkeep, those kind of things. And we have foundation services within our Run It series of services that allow us to handle those kind of things, and you still take on control of that, right? So an example of this is, I have a pool guy that comes in and takes care of the particulars, but I still have my own things to take out leaves and stuff like that. It's more of an assisted type of, it's probably co-managed, assisted type of service, and therefore that's an example of that. But we recognize that in this world of service providers and internal IT and organizations needing to expand their use of people, there's an extension of the team that needs to happen. We have these, industry, I guess, is calling it co-managed, and where you're taking advantage of your service providers to take over functional areas within your business. The way that Forthright does it, so there's no finger pointing or this, how do we take on responsibility? You define those responsibilities up front. You understand what those role matrices are. If you guys ever want to know what that looks like, I have no problem sharing with you our roles matrix. It is multiple Excel pages long of everything that you can possibly imagine within a Citrix environment that needs to be done. And there's a checkbox of whether it's Forthright responsibility, client, or another third-party vendor, because quite frankly, in today's world, we use multiple vendors, and sometimes that's what happens. And then ultimately, sometimes you just want to deal with a problem. Frank, I don't have time for this. We need to address this. Make it your responsibility. Own it. Give me the outcome I'm looking for. And that's where our Run It Complete services come into play. And it goes back to that example where I mentioned that, I don't do anything to my lawn, right? I have a lawn guy that comes in. I'm responsible to make sure that from an HOA perspective and the fact that I just want my house to look nice, it has to be cut on a regular basis. I don't care what he's using. I don't care the tools. I just make sure that it's happening on a regular basis. So when I come home, it should look good. And if it doesn't look good, I call him up and I'm like, hey man, fix it. And that's really what it is, right? Those are the three major areas. We can get into specifics into particular offerings. When I mentioned control up, I mentioned login simulation, I mentioned monitoring, NOC services, we have security-based services, Citrix-based services, all that jazz. But ultimately, it boils down to these three tiers of levels of management and support. The question is, what makes most sense to you guys? I think that we play well for all of them, and I think people are very, very happy in their respective areas. So there you go.
Well, Frank, I really appreciate all the information, and again, I want to open up everyone. Make sure you have or feel comfortable calling in or sending us an email to success@forthright.com, and we would love to continue the conversation if you want to talk to Frank about any of these topics. Kristen, go ahead and let's close this webinar out.
And on behalf of the Forthright team, I'd like to thank you all for your time this afternoon. Have a great day.